All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Carbon and Ecosystem Market session. Thanks for hanging on till the end with us. So as many of you have likely probably been observing in the last couple of years, there has been mounting interest in carbon and ecosystem markets from food and agricultural companies, from different governments, and from corporations in other industries. So there's a lot of information and terminology out there to kind of sort through in this new space. And so from this session, we hope to clarify some of those things for you. And ultimately, we want you as farmers and those of you who work with farmers to walk away from this better equipped with knowing what questions to ask when you're considering some of these different opportunities. So we have three very knowledgeable speakers to talk on this subject today. So first, we're going to hear from Kristin Foehringer. She is a soil scientist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, working in northwestern Wisconsin. She's going to kind of set the stage with an overview of the science of soil carbon and how that relates to these markets and the agroecosystem. Then we're going to hear from Jean Brokish. Jean is the Midwest Program Manager for American Farmland Trust, and she's joining us from Illinois today. She's going to talk over some of these key terms, motivations, some of the different players in this space, and compare some of the different program approaches too. And then last but not least, we will hear from Paul Dietmann. He is the Senior Lending Specialist at Compeer Financial, and he's going to kind of talk about the future outlook of carbon markets and talk about the current situation, cover some of the risks and challenges as well. So, Kristin, if you'd like to come up and start.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for staying till the end and for this session. My intention for this first part of the session is to describe the carbon cycle through an agricultural lens, discuss the role of soil carbon in the context of carbon markets, and then touch on how management can influence soil carbon dynamics and what that means for ecosystem services. So the context of the session is really a result of this expanding voluntary US market for carbon credits being these tradable assets that allow for the right to emit 1 metric ton or approximately 2,000 pounds of CO2 into the atmosphere or an equivalent in other greenhouse gases. So what this means for farmers is that they can be paid to essentially implement a practice that allows them to take carbon out of the atmosphere, so sequester carbon and put it into the soil, or to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production of food, fuel, and fiber. So examples of these would be converting to no-till or implementing cover crops. So these are practices that could potentially increase in carbon storage. And then an example of reducing greenhouse gas emissions would be reducing fertilizer inputs into a system. So there are uncertainties in whether these markets will benefit farmers for a couple of reasons. So one is farmers are inherently limited by their land base. So your land base and your carbon or your soil's ability to both optimize traditional commodity production, so conventional crops, and ecosystem services being carbon sequestration is limited by what you're working with. It can also be limited by the management and the operation in and of itself. And then the other uncertainty is how we're actually measuring carbon sequestration, the methodologies, and also how we're tracking that over time and if there are consistencies among protocols. So to set the stage for understanding how carbon moves through an ecosystem, I want to walk you Sure. Okay. Yep. Okay. So to understand how we're going to generate carbon credits, we need to understand the carbon cycle and how management influences this cycle. So this is a simplified version of the terrestrial carbon cycle, so the plant and soil component in an agricultural ecosystem. So I'll start with pointing out the difference between pools and fluxes. So the carbon pools are things like plant carbon, so above ground and below ground biomass of plants, and soil carbon. So these are reservoirs of where carbon can be stored. The fluxes are represented by the arrows. So we have gaseous losses of carbon with the arrows that are pointing up. So these are losses in the system and then losses to the atmosphere. And then we have storage or inputs represented by the arrows pointing down. So this is how we are storing carbon in the system. So simply put, we can increase carbon sequestration potential in a system if we minimize the up arrows and maximize the down arrows. So it's helpful to think of soil carbon and these ecosystems as a carbon bank. So essentially you want your inputs or deposits to be greater than your outputs and losses. And the goal is to put as much carbon into this bank as you can, utilizing management and biological processes. So starting with the concept of carbon farming. So we're looking at this part right here. So the idea of carbon farming is that you are sequestering carbon by pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere via photosynthesis in plant production. So that biomass goes into above ground and below ground components, which is part of this plant carbon pool. The plant carbon pool then results in inputs to the soil carbon pool via leaf litter litter turnover, root turnover, decomposition, and also through exudates that are exuded into the soil carbon pool. So anywhere between 10 and 70% of the photosynthetic products produced via photosynthesis can be sent below ground. So that depends on plant species composition and other dynamics, but that's a huge amount of photosynthetic carbon that can be pumped below ground to increase our soil carbon pools. So then those exudates that are exuded via plants into the soil carbon pool are meant to feed microbial communities, which have a beneficial impact on plant productivity and nutrient cycling. And then these organisms also have a whole other suite of ecosystem services and benefits. So it's important to note that there are losses with each of these gains. So you have the CO2 released via respiration from the plants and the CO2 released via respiration from the microbes, which is a result of the metabolism of those organisms. So another way to farm for carbon and increase carbon storage is to integrate livestock. So obviously the manure inputs are a great way to increase that soil carbon pool, but we also have CO2 being released from this component. So again, the goal would be to maximize practices that increase the inputs. I'm also showing the losses, the greenhouse gas losses and CO2 losses associated with the operation itself. So in agriculture, we have the opportunity to both sequester carbon and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by taking this systems approach. And then I want to highlight there's other ways in which carbon is lost. Soil erosion is one of them. Leaching losses are one, and then there's fire and volatilization. So this is a simplified version of how carbon's moving through the system, and these fluxes are influenced by management and by biological processes. So we can manipulate all of these components by changing management practices. For example, as I mentioned earlier, disturbing the soil less. So when you disturb the soil, you're volatilizing carbon, releasing it into the atmosphere. By minimizing disturbance and incorporating perennial systems, that is where you're really pumping carbon into this below ground component and can generate the most carbon credits and offsets. Okay, so this is where it gets messy. This slide is meant to demonstrate the two pathways for getting paid for carbon. So the first one is this process-based or practice-based pathway. So essentially by implementing a soil health conservation practice, or I would say conservation farming practice, you can get paid on the assumption that that practice is sequestering carbon or will result in carbon sequestration over time. I'll get to the rest of that top part later. This bottom part, ooh, that wasn't supposed to happen. The bottom part is the outcome-based approach. So I think this is the one that we might be more familiar when we're talking about carbon markets. The outcome-based approach is actually measuring a stock of carbon at a baseline point in time and then tracking it over time to monitor carbon storage after practice implementation. So this one gets much more complicated because we are talking about soil organic carbon, and essentially it's the units that we're buying and selling carbon credits. And I want to relate that to soil organic matter. So essentially when we're talking about soil organic carbon, we're talking about soil organic matter. They're used interchangeably. Where organic matter is 58% carbon, as well as hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and these other components that are important for nutrient cycling and feeding microbes. So we can easily convert back and forth between the two. So these outcome-based systems require the carbon concentration, so it's a direct measurement of soil, which requires the bulk density as well and a depth to scale. So this image over here is kind of a representation of what we're talking about when we say carbon stock. You have an area of soil and a depth of soil and a known carbon concentration, and you can extrapolate over an area. So these outcome-based systems quantify this measure directly and pay according to how much carbon is being captured and how that changes over time. So it gets messy because this is riddled with errors. And then the other option would be to model it using biogeochemical models or a combination of direct soil measurements, biogeochemical modeling, and remote sensing. So that's the outcome-based approach. The one thing that this misses is that by just focusing on narrowly on soil organic carbon, we are missing the connection between management, soil health, and other ecosystem services and what our end game is, right? Which is really improving water and air quality, human health, food quality, productivity, and food security. So when we're talking about soil carbon and carbon markets, it's important to recognize that the focus should really be on how improving soil carbon can have this chain reaction of other ecosystem service benefits, because those are things that aren't necessarily monetized, but benefit society at large. So again, some of the challenges in estimating carbon market outcomes are the spatial variability of fields. So a lot of these systems need to be directly verified. There are approximately 12 different protocols right now to do that. So if you apply 12 different protocols of estimating or quantifying soil carbon in the same area, you're going to end up with 12 different quantifications of carbon and different credits. So that's problematic in the sense that we need consistent carbon crediting. Again, we need baseline measurements. So that means we need to know the carbon stocks now and then how they change over time. There are errors associated with the field collection of the samples, the cores themselves. So these are typically 1 meter cores. Depth definitely matters at this point with respect to how much carbon is being stored. 50% of the carbon can be stored below that 30 centimeter, 12-inch mark. So below the rhizosphere, and oftentimes that's not quantified. So depending on the depth of samples, you can underestimate or overestimate carbon storage. There's errors in the lab sampling and the actual analysis itself. So to get soil organic carbon requires the use of an elemental analyzer, which is measuring the CO2 and the amount of carbon in a particular sample. So again, I think the focus should really be on how soil organic carbon and soil organic matter is the key to soil, water, animal, and human health. Because this is an additive process. So by engaging in carbon farming, you are accomplishing these suite of other ecosystem services and values that can benefit the carbon community or the farming community and society. Over to you.
All right, can you guys hear me? So I am Jean Brokish. I'm going to find my clicker here. I'm with American Farmland Trust, as Dana mentioned, and I'm just going to kind of walk you through some of the terms, considerations, some of the issues and challenges and opportunities of the whole carbon market system that we find ourselves in. Let me see. So I'm really kind of curious, just as a starting point. I've been here all day and I get the sense the majority of you are farmers, but just by a show of hands, how many of you in the audience are farmers? All right, any farm advisors, agronomists, CCAs? All right, researchers, extension, educator people? Any others? Anybody who fits in a box that I didn't mention yet that wants to admit it? All right. And then so I'm really glad to see so many farmers in the audience and welcome some questions about this topic, because I know there's a lot of discussion happening around this topic. So I'm also just kind of curious, baseline knowledge. How many of you have little to no knowledge about what ecosystem or carbon markets are all about? How many of you have done some research? Okay, how many of you have actually spoken with a market rep? And anybody out there who actually has or is pursuing a contract? All right, so kind of not even really a bell curve, just a good distribution across those different categories. Well, I'm going to just touch a little bit on the background of agricultural greenhouse gases, the whole carbon credit piece, and then where this carbon market opportunity comes and lands on the farm in terms of greenhouse gas reduction potential, different market approaches and financial incentives there, as well as just kind of a broader return on investment for soil health. So I'm going to just start quickly with some acknowledgements. I do work for American Farmland Trust. Many of you probably would recognize or know us better by our No Farms, No Food green bumper sticker that you might see on tractors or trucks driving around the country. We're a national nonprofit organization and really promoting good farming practices, farmland preservation, and keeping farmers on the land. One of my responsibilities is providing coordination for the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership. Don't hold it against me. I did come up from Illinois, but I am a Wisconsin girl by heart. I grew up in Dodgeville on a dairy farm and married a boy from Illinois. So I think my family disassociated me with me for a little bit, but I'm glad to be back here in Wisconsin. But one of my roles with American Farmland Trust is providing coordination for this group. And about a year and a half ago, we were being approached by market representatives saying, hey, we want to do a presentation for your farmers. We want to get in front of your farmers and tell them all about these carbon markets. And eventually my colleague, Emily Bruner, and I, we were like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We want to make sure that we're understanding this and that we're presenting transparent, honest, good information for our farmers. And so reached out to groups across the Midwest, including Wisconsin here, and that's how I connected with Dana. And for the last year and a half, we've really just been trying to create transparency, provide the right questions for farmers to ask so that you all can understand and make the decision for yourself. So just real quick overview of greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. Pie chart on the left there just shows, we're looking at a lot of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. Those are the greenhouse gases that we're talking about. And on the right pie chart shows just kind of where those greenhouse gases are coming from. So the vast majority is coming from transportation, industry, electricity, and then commercial and retail businesses, and only 10% of that pie is actually coming from agriculture. So smallest sector in terms of contributions, but you'll see in a minute here why there's a lot of opportunity for agriculture and why there's a lot of focus on agriculture right now. So my question for you, this is a big audience, but maybe someone's willing to holler out, where do agricultural greenhouse gases come from? Any ideas? I mean, you're generating 10% of what's happening in the US. Where is it being generated on farms? Cattle? Is that what you said? Through like the it is what they tell you. There's that cow farts are causing global warming, right? Yeah? Tillage. Diesel, fuel. Yep. Those are all potential sources. Well, this chart just kind of breaks down some of the agricultural greenhouse gas emissions there. And the vast majority are actually coming from soil management, agricultural soil management. So that's the top bar there. And that's about 50% of total agriculture greenhouse gases are coming from the soil management. And I have a second box, but the other red bars, you do see that enteric fermentation, the manure management, rice cultivation. I don't think there's much rice happening in Wisconsin, urea, fertilization, et cetera. But the blue box there then actually breaks down one of the largest agriculture greenhouse gases is actually nitrous oxide. So we're talking carbon. We have carbon, methane, and nitrous oxide as the key greenhouse gases, and agriculture is the largest contributor of nitrous oxide. So I list there some of the sources of nitrous oxide, synthetic fertilizer, the organic amendments like manure, compost, et cetera. Just the residue, what's happening in the crop residue, as well as mineralization and what the bacteria are doing in the soil. And then when we drain those organic soils, we release some of the nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. So I know what you're all thinking. Like, I came to talk to listen to a carbon market discussion, and I'm discussing nitrous oxide. It doesn't make any sense. It's important to understand that when we're talking about carbon markets, we're talking about collective greenhouse gases, which includes carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, and fluorinated gases. Carbon markets is kind of a shortcut or a nickname for what we're talking about. And when we discuss carbon markets, we're actually talking like in terms of carbon credits, which is carbon dioxide equivalents, or sometimes abbreviated as CO2e. And a carbon dioxide equivalent is really just expressed as what's equivalent to a metric ton of carbon dioxide. So 1 ton of carbon dioxide is 1 CO2e. Okay, that's what 1 credit is worth. And then based on how potent a greenhouse gas is in terms of how it reacts in the atmosphere, it gets another score. So you can see that carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1. Nitrous oxide has a global warming potential of 298. So 1 ton of nitrous oxide is equivalent to 298 tons of carbon dioxide. And then we have methane with a factor of 25. So this is what a carbon credit is. A carbon credit, again, is what's equivalent to a ton of carbon dioxide, or CO2e. And so carbon credits is what we're talking about when we're thinking about ecosystem markets or carbon markets here. And basically, a carbon market is just a payment to protect, restore, or mitigate for impacts to the environment. The practices are often part of traditional state and federal incentive programs. So we're talking about things like cover crops, no-till, nutrient management, manure management, biodigesters even. These are often practices that are already supported by federal and state cost share programs. However, the payments are generated based on the outcomes, which are verified at the farm level, not necessarily practice specific. And then the markets exist for carbon sequestration, as we've talked about, as well as other greenhouse gases. But there's also markets for water quality, water quantity, and there's even emerging markets around biodiversity and habitat. So this is just a real simplified schematic of how the carbon credits or carbon market is working, where on the top left, you have your industrial giant that has set some sort of climate target. So anybody here, I mean, Walmart, Microsoft, Kellogg's, Pepsi, so many companies have made sustainability and climate neutral pledges. And so they are saying, okay, to their consumers and to their shareholders, how are we going to achieve that? They're looking within their own systems, and you just follow the flow chart down. Have they cut enough carbon within their system? Yes, great, then they're done. More often than not, they cannot reduce enough carbon within their own systems. So they have to go to the arrow to the right and look at that offset market. And that market is really the connection point between the corporation and the farmer. It's called project developer on this graph, but it could be the farmer directly, but more often than not, it's like someone working as a broker connecting the farmer or farmers to the market system. And so that project, or what's happening on the farm then, is either removing carbon or avoiding emissions. The carbon market is the place where that transaction is happening and money is moving from the industrial giant to the project, farmer, et cetera. And so the boxes on the right are just key things to remember. Again, it's a measurable reduction or avoidance of greenhouse gas. It's equivalent to 1 metric ton of CO2e, and it's traded either via compliance or voluntary markets. The only compliance markets that I'm aware of in the US are like California has a cap and trade. Everything else that we're talking about is voluntary markets, and they're private, and they're being created and driven by corporations. And that's, I think, a really important point as you think about how this translates and how this benefits or doesn't benefit farmers. So just another quick schematic in terms of what's driving demand. This is a very, very simplified agricultural supply chain. So on the left, you have different steps in the supply chain, starting at the farm, going through processing, transportation, manufacturing, and then the retail and consumer level. And on the right-hand side, you have different players in each step. And the vast majority of the demand in carbon markets and ecosystem markets in the last couple of years is coming from these packaged good manufacturers. Your PepsiCo, your Kellogg's, your General Mills, et cetera. These are the companies that are making their sustainability pledges, and the consumers are demanding products produced in a certain way. So they're driving the demand, and they're saying, we can't reduce carbon enough in our own system, so they're looking upstream, right? The orange line I just drew there, 80% of greenhouse gas is produced above that orange line. So the majority of it is either through manufacturing, processing, transportation, distribution, et cetera. And to really change manufacturing and to really change transportation and processing and distribution, those are pretty technology heavy, expensive changes. So they continue looking upstream. And if you go far enough upstream, what do you find? Who's at the top of that watershed there? The farmers, right? So that's why the attention is coming to agriculture at this point. The industry is saying we cannot change our manufacturing fast enough. We cannot change our transportation fast enough to meet this demand for sustainably raised products. We need to go upstream. We are looking at agriculture to do that. And there's reason to look at agriculture. This is a map of cropland acres in the United States where there is potential to implement soil health practices and management practices that address greenhouse gases. So these are acres where you can implement cover crops, where you can reduce tillage and you can tweak your nutrient management. And collectively, there's 400 million acres of cropland with the potential for these practices. So then the question always becomes, well, how many credits can one farm generate? And of course, it's a huge resounding, it depends. This table is just kind of an average across multiple crops, across multiple geographies, multiple soil types, et cetera. And you do get a sense though of what the range is. So cover crops, somewhere between 0.16 and 0.77 tons of CO2e per acre per year, or about, at best, about 3/4 of a credit per acre for your cover crops. No-till and strip-till, similar, a little bit tighter range, somewhere between 0.4 and 0.74 tons of CO2e per acre per year. And when you combine the practices, you get a little bit of an additive effect, but it's not necessarily 1 + 1 = 2. So you're looking at somewhere between 3/4 and 1.1 credits there. And this map, this is a research study, a white paper that was done by American Farmland Trust by my colleague, Emily Bruner, just looking at using Comet Planner and state by state, averaging state by state. So even within the state of Wisconsin, you're gonna get vast differences based on soil type, based on cropping system, based on geography, precipitation, temperature, et cetera. But across Wisconsin, you're looking at an average of 0.12 metric tons of CO2e per acre per year for cover crops. So somewhere about 1/10 of a credit in Wisconsin by implementing a non-legume cover crop on acres that were previously without cover crops. For no-till, it's a little bit better, somewhere just over 0.54, 0.54 for Wisconsin average for no-till, and that is converting to no-till or strip-till on acres that were previously intensively tilled. And these are just kind of models and estimates, but this is what we're talking about as we're evaluating the potential for carbon markets on a farm, on your farm, on any farm. And then these are some concerns for credit generation. Additionality. This is, in my opinion, and rightfully so, the biggest rub for farmers like all of you who've been doing cover crops or have been doing reduced tillage for a while. This is the big rub for you all, because these markets are requiring that they are new practices. So if you've been doing the practices for a long time, most of the time you can't really enter the marketplace, or the piece of pie you can get out of the marketplace is much, much smaller. For some markets, they're taking into account some sort of look back period, and they may say, okay, you've only been doing it for 3 years, we're willing to look at that. Some markets are also looking at what's the average adoption rate in the county or counties around you, and if you're not status quo, then they might count that for their additionality purpose. But the devil's in the details, so you got to figure that one out and talk with your market rep to see if you qualify. Don't just write off the fact because you've been doing this for a while that you won't qualify. I think it's worth, if you're really interested, it's worth having that conversation and asking the tough questions. Permanence there, this comes into both how long is the contract length, but also if you say you're going to generate carbon credits by way of reduced tillage, and then 1 year you need to till because some weather happened or some disease happened or something, and you release that carbon, well, what is the penalty for that? And most markets are not doing penalties. What they're creating are called buffer pools, which is the equivalent of like a savings account for the carbon market. So they're saying, you're going to generate 10 credits. I'm going to pay you for 7, and I'm going to keep the other 3 because at some point in the future, you might not be able to generate a credit, and I'm going to be on the hook for it. Does that make sense? It's a savings account that benefits the market, not the farmer. Leakage is also just kind of looking at the full accounting of it. So this is just the full balance sheet. If you're implementing cover crops, but it takes an extra pass to terminate that cover crop, well, what's the fuel in that? So they're doing a full system accounting before they figure out what your credits can be. And then verification. This is most systems or most markets are using a combination of sampling, modeling, remote sensing, et cetera. All of them are requiring the farmer to keep some sort of records. So knowing what your capacity and your tolerance is for record keeping is important. So the next few slides, I just have some general market entity descriptions. I can run through these quickly, but I'm also going to refer you to a website where you can download a fact sheet with a lot more details. But these 4 entities here are true market entities. Nori and Indigo Ag on the top, they're focused primarily with carbon, whereas Soil and Water Outcomes Fund and Ecosystem Services Market Consortium also look at water quantity, water quality, in terms of what they're willing to pay for. You can see that it's looking at about $15, both Nori. When I shine this side, I know this side can't see. So, but Nori and Indigo Ag are looking at about $15 per ton. Soil and Water Outcomes Fund is a little higher because they're including water quality benefits in there. These are carbon programs from input suppliers. So these are probably companies that a lot of farmers are already working with. You know, you have Bayer, Corteva, Nutrien. Some cases they are offering just direct credit for things. Like Bayer is a pretty simplified approach where they're just offering $3 per acre for no-till or strip-till, $5 or $6 per acre for cover crops, $9 if you're doing both of them. It's pretty straightforward, pretty easy record keeping there. Nutrien at one point in their pilot phase was not paying the farmer, they were issuing credits for future products, so similar to a coupon system. And they're looking at about $20 per acre. All of these markets have a little like nuanced different ways of doing this. So again, devil's in the details, right? These are carbon programs from co-ops and data platforms. So SIBO, Farmers Business Network, and Truterra, which is a Land O'Lakes affiliate. All of them are already working with farmers for data management, yield data, et cetera, and they've integrated some sort of carbon type format into their platform. And again, I think some general prices are there between $20 to $35 per credit there. And then you can see under gradable, I have where 60% of the credits earned are transferred to the farmer, 15% are retained by gradable, and 25% of those are, that's the buffer pool I was talking about. So not 100% of this is going to the farmers. And the blue, the URL at the bottom there, the ilsustainableag.org/ecomarkets, that is the website where you can go and get a fact sheet that goes way into more detail about these different market entities and compares them for you. The last table I have are just kind of some general conservation incentive programs. So I like to throw this in here because a lot of the markets, they're still new, they're still evolving, and there's some risk involved in them. And so I like to just offer this as a contrast for you all. These tend to be less risky. They tend to be maybe more trustworthy or more tried and true and more readily available. So we have the EQIP and the CSP, and then the Wisconsin has the Soil and Water Resource Management Fund. All of those are paying on a practice basis. And then the Risk Management Agency also has the Pandemic Cover Crop Program again this year. This is the second year they're offering that $5 discount on your insurance premium for fields enrolled, planted to a cover crop. How am I doing on time? I'm good? Okay. All right, so I just have some quick potential payment back of the envelope calculations here. Starting again, do you remember those orange and blue maps where I showed you that Wisconsin could do about 0.12 credits for cover crops and 0.54 credits for no-till? That goes into that first line there. So if you're looking across the top, you have your carbon markets. You can generate 0.12 tons with cover crops at about a $15 per credit payment. That's $1.80. Raise your hand if you're willing to change your whole management system for $1.80 per acre. I didn't think so. No-till is a little bit better. It's $8.10 per acre, but that's just simple back of the envelope calculation based on an average credit payment of $15 per acre. So contrast that though with like EQIP payment of $64 per acre. That's the Wisconsin payment rate for fiscal year 22 for a multi-species cover crop. And then no-till is a little over $17 per acre. CSP payment rates there are like the additional practice. It doesn't account for practices for existing payments, which are part of CSP. And then the Soil and Water Resource Management payment rates are also there, $25 per acre for cover crop and $18.50 for no-till. And I included the PCCP too. So the good news though, and I really challenge people, for a farmer who's just starting or a farmer who's looking to expand, you can stack these payments and suddenly the numbers make a whole lot more sense in my book. So if you just stack EQIP and a carbon market payment together, you're looking at $66 an acre for cover crops and $25 an acre for no-till. It's a lot better than $1.80, isn't it? If you look at cover crops alone and just then factor in that $5 crop insurance discount, and I get it, this is a game. The timing has to work out. You have to get in EQIP, you have to get in the carbon market, and you have to have the pandemic cover crop insurance discount, but you're looking at $71 an acre potentially now. And if you're really good at the game and you can do cover crops and no-till on the same field, you're looking close to $90 per acre with a carbon market incentive payment on top. So I just offer that as a way. Don't discount this entirely. I think thinking through it and evaluating it and knowing what questions to ask is really important. So just have a few slides left here. I really enjoyed Dr. Wick's presentation this morning and the lessons she learned from farmers, because I feel like some of them are on here. Know your goal. Know what's reasonable for you. What kind of management changes can you make? What kind of technical support do you need and is available to you? And then what kinds of records are going to be necessary, and how much do you have available to you? How much are you willing to do? And then also just read the fine print. There's a lot of good resources out there. If you just Google what questions should a farmer ask about carbon credits, a lot of them will come up. For me, ultimately, I think it's important that you read the contract. Every market has a slightly different approach, and there's a lot of nuances in there. And ideally, you have an attorney who can help you. If you don't have an attorney, read the contract, highlight anything that you don't understand, and find someone who can help you understand it. Because I really think it's important to recognize that these markets, while they're a potential opportunity, they're not designed necessarily to benefit the farmer. So making sure that you read those details and have a sense of trust and transparency and understanding with who you're working with. So just some quick takeaways on the market. Market incentives alone may not be the most cost-effective means to increase the adoption of soil health practices, because frankly, they're not sufficient enough to justify those management changes, and they're not currently competitive with existing financial incentives. However, they may be right for a farmer who is already planning to change. If you're already thinking, or you have some new land that you're renting and you're starting to implement soil health practices on those fields, it may make a lot of sense for you. And you get an increased return on investment when those payments are stacked. And just 3 slides left, and I feel like I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but I just really want to encourage you all to never give up. I think we need to keep focused on the cheese. So whether these markets are going to be money in your pocket, or whether they're going to inspire your neighbor to finally do a practice or not, I don't know. But if we keep focused on the cheese, and in my mind, the cheese is healthy soil, clean water, and profitable farms, I think we all win. And we know that soil health practices can help achieve those things. So I feel like just focusing on the soil health is the equivalent of keeping focused on the cheese. And here is a list. Some of these were listed in the slides shared just a second ago, but this is a list of all the different potential practices that can fit into a soil health system. And these are the ones that are also potentially eligible or insertion points into an ecosystem market. And we also know that there's a lot of benefits of investing in soil health, just broadly speaking. This slide kind of shows the above ground benefits on the left, where we have that insulative cover, we reduce the evaporation, we increase infiltration and water storage, and we reduce runoff and flooding risks, and we reduce drought risk. We increase the weed suppression, which reduces the herbicide and the fuel use. And then on the right-hand side, there's a whole below ground benefits as well. And the items that are in bold there are also directly feeding into potential market incentives. So things like that reduced nitrous oxide emission by reducing your fertilizer inputs, reducing that water pollution and water runoff can play into a water quality credit market. So just, this is my last summary, then I'll turn it over to Paul. The adoption of soil health systems can increase crop resiliency. Ecosystem markets are a potential tool to help incentivize that adoption. And not all practices or programs fit every farm, but I think there is an opportunity for every farm to evaluate and identify a practice or a program that suits their needs. And my contact information is there on the screen, as well as the URL for the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership, where that resource document is stored. So you can check that out. I'll turn it over to Paul. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jean. Your slide with the mouse on it reminded me of a quote from Warren Buffett, that it's the second mouse that gets the cheese. So I'm hoping that's not true with the carbon markets, but well, I'm Paul Dietmann. I'm with Compeer Financial. Compeer is the Farm Credit System institution that covers about 2/3 of Wisconsin. We're kind of south and west of here. Ag country is in this territory. There's actually 3 farm credit system institutions in Wisconsin. Greenstone is the 3rd one. My role with Compeer, I co-lead our emerging markets loan program, which is a loan program for farmers who market their products direct to consumers or do something value added. So I work with a lot of farmers who are using managed grazing and a lot of other different types of innovative practices that are sequestering carbon. Compeer, about a year ago, started a carbon team. And we started that team for a couple different reasons. Number one, we wanted to see what we could do to support our farmers as they explored carbon markets and other ecosystem services. But the other reason that we started it is because we're starting to see that we're getting a bit of pressure from the other end, where our funds in the farm credit system, as a local association, we go to our wholesale bank, which is Agribank in the Twin Cities. That's where a lot of our loan funds come from. Agribank gets their funds from the Farm Credit Funding Corporation, which is selling bonds on Wall Street. And a lot of those investors on Wall Street are asking a lot of questions about what we're doing in the system to support the reduction of carbon in the environment. And we know that at some point it's probably going to affect our cost of funds, which of course then affects your cost of funds because we're passing that on, obviously. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we see in the carbon market and where I think it is now and where I think it's heading. You know, there's a lot of talk, a lot of companies jumping into carbon trading. Jean talked about a number of the main players in this business, but it seems like there's new carbon markets developing on a daily basis. The US market is mostly voluntary, except for California. California actually has a cap and trade system, but in the rest of the country, it's a voluntary system. Europe has a cap and trade system. So it's a much different system in most of the country than we have in the world. Each carbon program is, as Jean outlined, is very unique. They all have their own rules, incentives, contracts. Some contracts are a year at a time. Some contracts are 4 or 5 years at a time. So everyone is different. The penalties are different if you can't meet your targets, or if for some reason you have an off year where you end up having to tear up a field or something, and now you're not sequestering carbon in that field. So everyone is different. Most of the programs are requiring growers to do something different than what they're doing right now. So in other words, if you've been an early adopter of cover cropping, you've been doing it for 10 years or 15 years, unfortunately, these markets are kind of shutting you out. I'm sure a lot of you have found that already. And that's really unfortunate. And then again, most of the programs are using modeling to predict the amount of carbon that's being sequestered, and we don't really know how much carbon is actually being sequestered. So that's kind of the current situation that we're seeing. Challenges and risks that we see. This isn't the first time that we've had a voluntary market for ecosystem services. Have any of you heard of the Chicago Climate Exchange? Chicago Climate Exchange was in existence from 2003 to 2010. It was developed because there was a feeling that there was a political will in the country to adopt a cap and trade system. So in other words, industrial polluters would be capped at the amount of carbon that they could release into the atmosphere. If they wanted to go above that, they actually had to go out to the market and buy credits to offset the amount of carbon that they were releasing. And under cap and trade, a lot of times they're reducing those caps over a period of time. So they're trying to tamp down the amount of carbon that gets released. By 2010, it was apparent that there wasn't the political will in the country to develop a cap and trade system. So that was the end of the Chicago Climate Exchange. There's so much competition, and I think Jean's slides that showed all the different programs, the main programs that exist, and the way that they pay and the practices that they incentivize show there's so many different programs that it's really difficult for a grower to try to go through and figure out which one of these 15 or 20 or 30 programs is the one that fits my situation most effectively. I think because we've got so many different programs that some of these programs, maybe a significant number of these programs aren't going to survive. You know, I think there's just too many people, too many players in the market for everybody to survive long-term. So which one of those programs are you going to pick? Which one are you going to pick the winner? How do you pick the winner? And if you pick the loser and that program dies, what happens to you and what happens to your contract? So that's a challenge in the market right now. Again, we talked about farmers who are early adopters have been pretty much shut out of the market, which is really unfortunate that you're the folks who took the risk, did this first, showed the rest of the farmers the way, and then you don't get to take advantage of this market. There's little price transparency in the US carbon credits market. You know, Gene said $15 to $30 a ton, roughly. That's kind of what we hear a carbon credit is worth. The price in Europe, which is more transparent because it is a cap and trade system, they have a transparent market. The price recently hit almost $100 a ton. And it's because with the cost of natural gas rising, all of a sudden coal became more attractive and they had to buy carbon credits to offset the use of coal. So, so you can see the discrepancy in the market when we're 15 to 30 and they're at 100. There's a fairness issue here. So where does the market need to go? I think we need more transparency in the market, number one. I think we need transparency in the contracts. We need transparency in prices, in how carbon credits are being evaluated, how we're measuring carbon. There needs to be more uniformity in that carbon sequestration modeling. We need easier ways to compare the trading schemes across different companies. And I think universities have been stepping up and trying to help producers understand, and compare one contract to another. We need to ensure that there's grower protection in the event of disputes or if a carbon trading company goes belly up. You know, if you were selling grain to an elevator here in Wisconsin, you've got producer security. We know that if that grain elevator goes down, you're going to end up getting paid for your grain because there's a bonding system. They have to pay into producer security. We don't have that right now in the carbon market. So what happens if your company doesn't make it? And then the price per ton needs to increase significantly because as Gene said, there's not, right now there isn't enough incentive to cause someone to change practices or put off adopting a practice because this market is so lucrative that you want to jump into it. This is kind of redundant. I stole a couple of slides from Gene, so you've seen these numbers before. But I think the point that she made is really important and it bears repeating, and that's that there are a lot of good reasons to do this. And there's a lot of other ways to get paid for these ecosystem services in ways that don't require you to sign a lengthy contract that has a lot of language that's difficult to understand. And I guess personally, I would rather work with the Land Conservation Department in Iowa County, where my land is located, or the Natural Resources Conservation Service office in Iowa County, where I can go and stop into that office and talk to those folks and understand what they expect me to do on my land if I'm going to get an equip payment on it, as opposed to a contract that you're signing with some company that God knows where they are. But you can stack these up. And so if you're already doing this, you're already getting incentives to add that other layer. If it makes sense for you to add that other layer, by all means, you should think about doing it. This is some work that the Gene's organization, the American Farmland Trust, did. They've done a number of case studies of farmers who've adopted ecosystem services practices, or practices that are sequestering carbon. And they've done a nice job of putting together a partial budget analysis for each one of these farms to show what are the actual impacts, so there are yield impacts, there's extra costs maybe that are associated, but what's the net benefit? And so take a look at those. If you were in that session that or one of the breakout sessions just before this general session on the economics of soil health, the project that's being done at Southwest Tech, that sort of stuff, that we need a lot more of that. We need to be able to document what are the economic benefits of these soil health practices. The case studies that American Farmland Trust has done show that there's some the increase in yield per acre, There is some extra cost per acre, but the net benefit is actually pretty significant from adopting these practices. So some recommendations, I guess, to end this part of the session. There are a lot of good financial reasons, a lot of other reasons, soil tilth and things like that. Good reasons to adopt these practices, and you should not avoid adopting practices because you think that the carbon market's going to get better down the road. I think it will, but I wouldn't forego adopting practices waiting for that to happen. You may want to consider signing on just to avoid being shut out of the market. You know, some of these things like the Indigo Ag program, they'll do a 2-year look back. You know, if you're going into your 3rd year of cover cropping, you may want to sign on to that program. I don't know that it's such a lucrative program right now, but you may want to sign on just to be in it and avoid being shut out of it. Get advice from a trusted third party, and that's extension or land conservation or the tech college system before you sign a contract. Have someone take a look at it and give you some advice, whether it makes sense for your situation or not.